Welcome back, everyone. We are up to lessons 10 and 11 of Unit 3. And in this lesson, in this video, we're going to talk about something that you've probably never learned about before. We're actually going to introduce a new number system. All right. Our traditional number system, the one that you've used since you've started learning math in elementary school, is known as the real numbers. Okay. In the real number system, your traditional number system, one of the characteristics of the real numbers is that we've always said we cannot square root a negative number. So I can't take the square root of negative 25 because it's impossible in the real number system to take the square root to square a number and have the answer be negative. In the real number system, whenever I square a number, the answer is always going to be positive. So what they did was they invented a new number system was invented called the imaginary numbers. And this new number system, the imaginary numbers, was invented to give negative square roots a value. Okay. And before anybody asks, just because they're imaginary numbers doesn't mean they're called fake numbers. They could have been called red numbers or green numbers. They just decided to call them imaginary numbers. And like I said, this imaginary number system was invented to give negative square roots a value. And this entire number system is based on these two facts right here. What they did was they took the variable I is short for imaginary, and they denoted this I is equal to the square root of negative 1. So they let I be equal to the square root of negative 1. Okay. So in this case, I squared would have to be equal to negative 1. So essentially what's going to happen is when we do negative square roots in the imaginary number system, we can treat them as if they're positive square roots. The only difference is that we're going to tack on an I at the end. So I have a few examples here. The square root of negative 1, okay, normally in the real number system, if this were the square root of positive 1, we would say that the square root of positive 1 is positive or negative 1, okay? Well, in this case, we're going to say the square root of negative 1 is positive and negative 1i, okay? If I had the square root of positive 4, okay, we know in the real number system, the square root of 4 is positive and negative 2, but in the imaginary number system, the square root of negative 4 is going to be equal to positive and negative 2i. And same thing here. If I had the square root of positive 9, okay, the square root of positive 9 would be positive and negative 3. Well, in the imaginary number system, the square root of negative 9 would be equal to positive and negative 3i. Okay, so that's how we're going to treat negative square roots in this imaginary number system. So if you were to take the real numbers, our traditional number system, and the imaginary numbers, again, this new number system, if you were to take these two number systems and combine them, you end up with what we call the complex numbers. So a complex number is simply a combination of a real number and an imaginary number. So I have an example here of 3 plus 4i. Okay, notice there's a real number, 3, and there's an imaginary number, an I term, 4i, and I put them together, 3 plus 4i, that's called a complex number. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at the first set of examples for this lesson. Okay, so number 1, so write these square roots using I and show why your answer is correct, okay? And for this particular one, we're just going to do the positive square roots. For this one, the negative square roots would work the same way, but just for the sake of this exercise, we're just going to do the positive square roots. So if I have the square root of negative 36, okay, if I had the square root of 36, I know that that answer would be 6, but the square root of negative 36 would be 6i, okay? So the square root of negative 36 would be 6i. So that is the answer. Now we have to show why our answer is correct. And the reason why it's correct is because if I were to take 6i and square it, so if I were to take the imaginary number 6i and square it, multiply it by itself, I would end up with 36. 6 times 6 is 36. I squared. Okay. And one of the important facts of this imaginary number system, to go back to the lesson notes for a second, is that I squared is equal to negative 1. So 36 times I squared is really 36 times negative 1, which I know is negative 36. So to answer this question, the square root of negative 36 is 6i. Okay. And the reason it's true is if I take 6i and I square it, I get negative 36. Okay. So number 2, square root of negative 10. Okay. This one's an interesting case because if this were the square root of 10, the square root of 10 is not a perfect square. So in cases like this, when I have a square root that is not a perfect square, I'm going to rewrite it as a positive square root, but I'm going to tack on an I at the end. So I'm going to say the square root of negative 10 equals the square root of 10 I times I. Now notice, and I want you to take notice here, notice I put the I outside the square root. Okay, so in cases like this, when I rewrite it as a positive square root and tack on an I at the end, okay, that I has to go outside the square root. So we did that. Now we have to show why it's true. So if I were to take the square root of 10i and multiply it by itself, in other words, square it, what would happen? Well, let's see. The square root of 10 times the square root of 10, okay? The square root of 10 times the square root of 10 would be 10. I times I would be I squared. And 10 times I squared is 10 times negative 1, which is, of course, negative 10. So that's why that is true. Okay. Number 3, we have negative square root of negative 100. Negative square root of negative 100. So if this were the negative square root of 100, the answer would be negative 10. But the negative square root of negative 100 is going to be negative 10i. Okay, so it's going to be negative 10i. And to show it's true, all right, to show it's true, I'm going to take negative 10i and I'm going to multiply it by itself. I'm going to square it. All right, so negative 10 times negative 10 is 100. I times I is I squared. And I squared is negative 1. So 100 times I squared is 100 times negative 1, which equals the number under the square root, negative 100. So again, we're finding the answer and we're showing why it's true. Okay. So now I'm going to do number 4. I'm going to do number 4 down here. So now I have the negative square root of negative 17 So 17 is not a perfect square. So this is going to be negative square root of positive 17, but I'm going to tack on an I at the end. Okay, so negative square root of 17, I. And now to show it's true, I'm going to take that answer and square it. So I'm going to take negative square root of 17, I, times negative square root of 17, I. Okay. So first things first, negative square root of 17 times negative square root of 17. Negative times negative, that's going to be positive. So negative square root of 17 times negative square root of 17 is going to be positive 17. I times I is I squared. And once again, I squared is equal to negative 1. So 17 times negative 1 is negative 17, and that is the number that is under the square root.